185,000 soldiers went to sleep inside the most fortified military camp on Earth. Not one of them woke up. There was no battle, no alarm, no fire, no sound at all. Just the slow creep of a cold morning revealing a graveyard of steel, where the greatest army the ancient world had ever produced lay perfectly, silently dead. Historians have argued about what killed them for 2,700 years. And the answer, when you follow the evidence all the way to the end, is more disturbing than any supernatural explanation ever offered. But before we get there, you need to understand what was actually destroyed that night. Because if you picture a rabble of soldiers camped outside a city, you have the wrong image entirely. What gathered outside the walls of Jerusalem in the year 701 before the Common Era was not an army. It was a civilization in military form. An empire that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the industrialization of human suffering. And understanding exactly what that meant, in iron and blood and broken bone, is the only way to grasp the true weight of what was erased by dawn. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had no rivals, not in technology, not in logistics, not in the deliberate, institutional use of terror as a governing instrument. By the late 8th century, Assyria commanded a standing professional army capable of mobilizing upward of 300,000 men. Not conscripts dragged from farms, professionals. Men who drilled in combined arms tactics, who understood siege mathematics, who had crossed the same desert corridors so many times they could navigate by the smell of the dust. No other state on Earth came close to that number. No other state on Earth had thought to try. Their logistics alone were a kind of genius, brutal in its elegance. Assyrian campaigns were never launched at random. They were timed to the harvest seasons of neighboring kingdoms with predatory precision, planned months in advance so that the moment the army crossed the border, it could live entirely off the land it was consuming. The fields of the enemy fed the soldiers, destroying them. The granaries of the conquered restocked the caravans of the conqueror. And the finest war horses of every subjugated kingdom were systematically seized and absorbed into the Assyrian cavalry, ensuring that no defeated nation could ever rebuild the one asset capable of matching Assyrian mobility in the field. The empire didn't just defeat its enemies. It restructured the physical conditions of the region so that resistance became progressively more impossible with each passing decade. On the battlefield itself, Assyrian tactics operated in tightly coordinated waves. Skirmishers and archers opened the engagement at range, raining iron and sharpened stone on defenders before they could form a response. Then the heavy infantry surged forward, men armored in iron scales carrying lances and short swords, pressing into the confusion the archers had created. Then came the cavalry and the shock chariots, driving through exposed flanks or punching directly into the fracture points of an enemy line that was already breaking. The genius of the system was in the sequencing. Each element was designed to create the conditions for the next. By the time the chariots arrived, the battle was already decided. What followed was not fighting, it was harvest. For fortified cities, they brought something worse than cavalry. The Assyrians operated what their own records describe in almost loving technical detail. Massive, lumbering siege engines. Leather-armored constructions the size of a small building, pushed forward on wooden rollers by teams of men protected inside. Some carried giant water ladles to extinguish flaming projectiles thrown from the walls. Others carried iron-tipped rams, blunt and enormously heavy, driven repeatedly into the same section of brick and stone until the wall groaned and the defenders above began to understand they were already dead. These weren't improvised weapons. They were manufactured products of an empire with dedicated engineers, tested designs, and decades of institutional knowledge about exactly which angle of attack would collapse a wall fastest. But none of this, not the cavalry, not the siege engines, not the iron, was the Assyrians' most effective weapon. That was fear. Deliberate, manufactured, infrastructural fear, deployed as a policy instrument with the same cold calculation a modern state might apply to taxation or road building. Conquered towns weren't simply occupied. They were systematically annihilated and left as monuments to consequence. Surviving populations were deported wholesale, their cultural identities dissolved by distance and displacement. Assyrian royal inscriptions, carved into stone for public display, boast openly of flaying captured soldiers alive and draping their skin over city walls, of impaling prominent citizens on wooden stakes outside city gates. The records don't hide this. They advertise it. Because the point was never simply to defeat the enemy in front of you. The point was to make every other potential enemy watch and understand and decide that submission was the only mathematics that worked. At the center of this apparatus, in 701, stood King Sennacherib, son of Sargon II, commander of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. A man who described himself in official records as the unrivaled king, the perfect man, the virile warrior who strikes enemies with lightning. These were not metaphors in the literary sense. In the ancient Near East, language of this kind carried theological weight. Kings did not merely rule in the name of the gods. They represented the gods' extension into the physical world. Sennacherib's power was not simply military. It was, in the worldview of the time, cosmological. To resist him was to resist the order of the universe itself. He had spent the years preceding 701 proving that claim with blood. Sweeping down the Levantine coast with methodical violence, he had captured 46 fortified Judean cities before he ever reached Jerusalem. 46. Each one defended, each one taken. His own records describe using stamped earth ramps, siege engines, mines, breaches, and infantry assault simultaneously. He was not besieging cities, he was processing them. The economic toll extracted from King Hezekiah of Judah alone amounted to 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, roughly 1 metric ton of gold and 10 metric tons of silver, stripped so thoroughly from the royal treasury and the doors and pillars of the temple itself that the hinges came off in the removal. Sennacherib's records also list, with the bureaucratic satisfaction of an accountant, the tribute's softer components: antimony, ivory-inlaid beds and armchairs, elephant hides, elephant tusks, rare woods, and Hezekiah's own daughters dragged back to Nineveh as possessions. And then Sennacherib wrote the line that would define his legacy. The line he was so proud of that he had it carved onto multiple stone cylinders for preservation and distribution. He had Hezekiah confined in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. He set up blockades and made him dread exiting his city gate. That image, the caged bird, the great king pressing his thumb down on the last holdout king, was designed as a capstone, the final proof of invincibility. He did not know it was an epitaph. Inside the walls of Jerusalem, the atmosphere on that final night before the expected assault was not the atmosphere of people preparing to fight. It was the atmosphere of people preparing to die. The city had become something between a fortress and a mass grave in waiting. After the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel 20 years earlier, and the systematic destruction of the Judean countryside in the weeks prior, refugees had flooded Jerusalem from every direction. The population had swelled to roughly 25,000 people, compressed into a perimeter of just 125 acres. People who had watched their towns burn. People who had arrived with nothing. People who understood, with the clarity that only total desperation provides, exactly what Assyrian soldiers did to the populations of cities that required a siege to capture. King Hezekiah had not been passive. He'd executed a desperate, invasive engineering campaign to survive as long as possible. He sealed the springs and streams outside the city, redirecting the water supply through solid bedrock via a tunnel carved by hand through 600 meters of limestone. He tore down the homes of his own citizens to clear ground for a new western fortification. The broad wall, excavated in 1969, measured 7 meters thick, stood approximately 27 feet high, and stretched at minimum 210 feet in length. By the standards of the ancient world, it was extraordinary defensive architecture. By the standards of what was camped on the other side of it, it was a delay, not a defense. From the walls, the defenders could see the Assyrian preparations for the final assault beginning. Brushwood gathered in quantities that made the purpose obvious. They were planning to pile it against the walls and ignite it, using sustained heat to crack the masonry. Sappers were beginning to break ground for siege ramps. Battering rams were positioned. The Assyrian psychological warfare arm had already deployed its most sophisticated weapon, a senior official called the Rabshakeh, who stood in front of the broad wall and delivered his threats not in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the region, but in Hebrew, loudly, so that every soldier and refugee clinging to the parapet above could hear every word.
He said, and he meant it as devastation, that no god of any nation had ever protected its people from the Assyrian king. He named the cities that had fallen. He named their gods. He listed them like receipts. And then he said that Yahweh, the God of Jerusalem, would do no better. He was not wrong about the historical record he cited. He was only wrong about what was already moving through the dark toward his camp. And neither he, nor Sennacherib, nor anyone in that sealed, terrified city had any idea what that thing actually was. That question, what it was, is the one this story was always really about. And the answer exists in 3 separate categories of evidence that, when they finally converge, produce something considerably more unsettling than a miracle. Here is the detail that every account of this event skips past too quickly, because it is the detail that makes everything else impossible to explain away. The Assyrian camp at Jerusalem was not an unguarded bivouac of exhausted men sleeping in the open. It was a fully operational military installation, fortified with 24 guard towers, each one manned through the night in rotating shifts. The perimeter was sealed. The interior was packed with battle-hardened soldiers who had survived 46 previous sieges without flinching. These were not men who died easily. They were men who had built a professional identity around not dying. And every single one of them was dead before the sun came up. No tower raised an alarm. No horn sounded. No fire broke out from an overturned brazier. No shout carried across the camp. No sound of struggle reached the walls of Jerusalem 200 meters away, where 25,000 terrified people were lying awake, listening for exactly that. The silence was total. And the silence is the part that cannot be explained by any conventional military event, by any human force, by any weapon that leaves marks. Whatever moved through that camp did it without friction, without resistance, without a single soldier
managing to draw a sword. That silence has a name in the ancient texts. Several names, depending on which tradition is doing the naming. And to understand what those names actually describe, you need to unlearn almost everything the word angel has come to mean in the last 5 centuries of Western art.
The entity credited in the Hebrew record with the destruction of the Assyrian camp is not the figure standing over a crib in a Renaissance painting. It is not the soft-winged guardian of a greeting card, or the luminous herald of a nativity scene. Those images are theological products of a much later era, developed in contexts of comfort and reassurance, designed to make the divine feel approachable. The entity in the ancient texts predates all of that by 1,000 years, and it was not designed to be approachable. It was designed to be effective. Its name in the Hebrew tradition is Malach Ha-Mashhit, the destroying angel, or more precisely, Ha-Mashhit alone, the destroyer. The grammatical construction matters. It is not a destroyer among others. It is the definitive article, the only one of its kind. When the text of Exodus reaches the moment of the final plague in Egypt, the killing of the firstborn, it describes the blood on the doorposts not as a symbol of faith, but as a physical boundary marker, something the destroyer would recognize and stop at. The implication is explicit and deeply strange. The blood was not for God. It was a restraint on the destroyer, a cage drawn in blood to contain something that would otherwise have continued killing without discrimination, without instruction, without limit. The theological portrait that emerges is not of a servant following orders. It is of a force being temporarily aimed and then held back before it overshoots its target. In the Book of Chronicles, this same entity appears standing suspended between earth and sky over Jerusalem, with a drawn sword in its hand, in the middle of an act of mass killing, and has to be explicitly commanded to stop. It does not stop on its own. It does not moderate itself. It has to be halted. This is not the behavior of a guardian. This is the behavior of something that functions closer to a weapon than a will, a cosmic instrument calibrated for destruction and capable of nothing else until an external force intervenes. The nearest cultural equivalent in the ancient Levantine world was a deity named Reshef, and Reshef is where the portrait gets darker. Worshipped across the ancient Near East from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era until well into the 1st century, Reshef was a god of war and sudden plague, associated specifically with the gates of the underworld and with something the texts describe as his arrows. In the Ugaritic literature of the 13th century, he carries the title Lord of the Arrow. Ancient iconography shows him with a raised axe or a drawn bow, menacing in posture, active rather than passive, a figure caught in the permanent moment before the strike. His arrows were understood as the invisible vectors of epidemic disease, forces that struck from an impossible distance with lethal precision and left no trace of their origin. The arrow was not a metaphor for death in general. It was a specific description of the mechanism, something that travels through air, penetrates without warning, and kills before the target understands it has been struck. This triple linkage between the divine, the arrow, and epidemic death appears in the Hebrew scriptures as well, where Reshef and Dever, which translates as pestilence, are described as the flanking executioners marching alongside the divine presence. Not followers, not servants exactly, enforcers, boundary keepers operating in the space between the living and the dead, deployed when a violation of cosmic order has become severe enough to require correction that human hands cannot provide. The Mesopotamian equivalent was Nergal, god of war and epidemic,
ruler of the underworld, the divine enforcer dispatched when the boundaries between acceptable human ambition and cosmic transgression had been irreparably crossed. Later, in the rabbinic and mystical traditions, these figures would partially merge with a figure named Samael, described in the mystical literature as possessing cold beauty and predatory spiritual desire, the ultimate drinker of life, the shadow thrown by existence itself. The theology evolved across centuries and cultures, but the functional identity of the entity never changed. It was not a protector, it was an executioner. Specifically, a cold, calculating, targeted executioner, dispatched not in anger, but in something more frightening than anger, in precision.
Now hold that portrait in your mind, because what the ancient sources describe happening in the camp at Jerusalem fits that profile with an accuracy that is either remarkable coincidence or something else entirely. The biblical account in 2 Kings delivers the event in a single sentence, and the sentence is more disturbing for its brevity than any elaborate description could be. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. That is the entire account. One sentence for the death of 185,000 men. No description of suffering, no description of movement or sound, just a night, a going out, a smiting, and then mourning and bodies. The grammatical structure of the original Hebrew is worth noting. The angel went out once. Past tense, singular action, completed. Whatever it did in a single pass. Lord Byron, writing in 1815, intuited something about this event that most historians have been too cautious to name directly. He wrote of the angel spreading wings on the blast, breathing on the face of the foe as it passed, the eyes of the sleepers growing deadly and chill, their hearts heaving once and then growing forever still. Atmospheric, respiratory, a force that moves through air and enters through breath and kills from the inside. Byron was writing poetry, but he was reaching, with a poet's instinct, toward the correct mechanism. He just didn't know it yet. Because what the event most precisely resembles, when you strip the theological framing and apply modern medical knowledge, is not a supernatural visitation. It is a biological one. And the specific pathology it resembles is one of the fastest and most complete killers in the history of human disease. Septicemic plague. Not bubonic, septicemic. The distinction is critical, and it is the distinction that almost every popular account of this event ignores. Bubonic plague, the version most people know from medieval history, requires several days to develop. The bacteria migrate from the entry point to the lymph nodes, which swell into painful, visible masses called buboes, and the patient suffers a visible, progressive deterioration over days or occasionally weeks. There is time for diagnosis, time for others to recognize the dying, time for the camp to understand what is happening to it. Septicemic plague operates on an entirely different timeline. The bacteria enter the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic stage entirely. They multiply in the blood itself, producing toxins at a rate the immune system cannot respond to. The mechanism of death is disseminated intravascular coagulation, a catastrophic systemic failure in which the blood's clotting mechanisms are triggered everywhere simultaneously, consuming all available clotting factors and causing the patient to bleed internally from every surface at once. The skin blackens as blood pools beneath it. The organs fail in sequence. And this entire cascade, from initial infection to death, can complete in under 24 hours,
often in 12, often without any external symptom that would alert a sleeping companion that anything had happened at all. A man infected at midnight might be dead by the time the guard rotation came to wake him at dawn, and the man sleeping 6 inches away might never have stirred.
The Assyrian camp was a perfect incubator for this. Not accidentally. Structurally perfect. Months of continuous campaigning through the Levantine summer meant the camp had been stationary long enough to accumulate the biological conditions that matter. Human and animal waste in proximity to sleeping quarters. The physical stress of extended siege operations suppressing immune function across the entire population simultaneously. And, critically, the presence in enormous numbers of the one animal that serves as the primary reservoir for Yersinia pestis. Rats. The same rats that infested every long-term military encampment in the ancient world. The same rats whose fleas carry the bacteria between hosts. The same rats that, in an irony so precise it borders on design, would later be recorded by a Greek historian as having been present in the camp in numbers too large to ignore. That historian was Herodotus, and what he recorded was stranger than anything the biblical account describes, and more useful to a forensic investigation than almost any other ancient source. He wrote that the Assyrian camp was overrun by thousands of field mice during the night, that the mice gnawed through the soldiers' bowstrings, their quiver leather, and the leather straps of their shields, that by morning the army was defenseless and suffered catastrophic losses in the retreat that followed. Every modern scholar who cites this passage treats it as a corrupted myth, a folk explanation for a military disaster that the original witnesses couldn't otherwise account for. But read it again with different eyes. An army does not lose its bowstrings to mice by accident. That happens when rodent populations reach densities consistent with a full-scale infestation, the kind of infestation that occurs when a large military camp has been stationary for an extended period, generating enough food waste and human refuse to support an explosive rodent population bloom. The mice gnawing the leather is not the event. It is the visible evidence of the event's true cause. The mice were the symptom. The fleas on the mice were the weapon. And this is where the portrait of the celestial assassin and the portrait of Yersinia pestis begin to overlap so completely that distinguishing between them becomes, in a certain light, beside the point. Both are invisible. Both move through the air without being seen. Both strike without physical contact in any form the victim can detect. Both kill in the dark, in silence, without the victim understanding what has happened to them. Both are indifferent to armor, to rank, to combat skill, to the number of swords a man carries. The ancient texts described an entity that moved through a sealed, guarded military perimeter without triggering a single alarm and left no mark of its passage except the dead. Modern epidemiology describes a bacterium that does exactly the same thing. The question of whether those two descriptions refer to the same event, or two different explanations for the same event, or two different ways of understanding one reality, is a question this story refuses to answer for you. And that refusal is intentional. Because the truly unsettling thing is not the answer. It is the realization that both explanations lead to the same place. A cold, invisible, efficient force that targets biological life with no interest in the identity of its host, no capacity for mercy, and no mechanism for stopping itself once it has been released. A force that was not conjured by Hezekiah and cannot be credited to Assyrian incompetence. A force that arrived from somewhere outside the logic of the conflict
and ended it on terms that neither side chose and neither side could have anticipated. What moved through the camp at Ammunition Hill that night was, by every available account, something that operates by different rules than the ones that govern human warfare. Whether you call it an angel or a bacterium is a theological question. What it did to 185,000 men is not.
But here is the detail that keeps historians awake at night, the one that never quite makes it into the popular accounts. The entity, according to the Book of Chronicles, did not kill at random. It annihilated every mighty warrior, commander, and officer in the camp of the king of Assyria. That is a decapitation strike. That is a targeting profile. Whatever moved through that perimeter did not kill the way a plague kills, moving outward from a point of infection in concentric rings of transmission. It killed the command structure first, the generals, the senior officers, the captains, the men whose deaths would leave the surviving soldiers without coordination, without orders, without the ability to function as a military unit, even if they had survived. That is not the behavior of a bacterium. That is the behavior of something that understood what it was doing.
And that is the question we must answer next. Because in June of 2024, an independent scholar published findings in a peer-reviewed journal that placed the physical location of that camp on a specific hill in modern Jerusalem, preserved in its name for 2,500 years by people who had never forgotten what happened there. And what he found changes not just the history of this siege, but the history of how we read every ancient military record that came after it. For most of the 20th century, the most powerful argument against the 701 siege was the one nobody said out loud, but everybody thought. If 185,000 soldiers died in a single night outside Jerusalem, where are they? Where is the camp? Where are the siege ramps, the post holes, the fire pits, the detritus that an army of that size leaves behind, the way a tide leaves wreckage? Archaeology is patient. It finds things. It found the mass graves of the 30 Years' War under German farmland. It found the remains of Roman legions in German forest. It found the anchors of the Spanish Armada on the Irish seabed. But for over a century of systematic excavation in and around Jerusalem, nobody found the Assyrian camp. And that absence was wielded like a weapon by every scholar who wanted to reduce the siege to theology dressed as history. What they missed, it turns out, was that they had been looking at it the wrong way, not in the wrong place, in the wrong conceptual frame. Because the camp was never buried. It was hiding in plain sight, preserved not underground, but in a name. And finding it required not a shovel, but a map, a photograph taken from an airplane in 1917, and a scholar willing to ask a question that everyone else had apparently decided was already answered. Stephen Compton is not a household name in biblical archaeology. He is an independent scholar, which in academic circles carries a specific weight, sometimes dismissive, sometimes the opposite, depending entirely on whether the independent scholar turns out to be right. In June of 2024, he published his findings in Near Eastern Archaeology, one of the field's peer-reviewed journals, and the findings were the kind that make established researchers quietly furious because they are so simple. The methodology was almost insultingly elegant, and the result was the first physical, verifiable location of an Assyrian military camp associated with the 701 siege. He began not in Jerusalem, but in Lachish. Because Lachish is where Sennacherib left the most detailed record of his own military methodology, not in writing, but in stone. The carved relief panels from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh depicting the siege of Lachish, are among the most detailed military illustrations to survive from the ancient world. They show the battering rams, the siege ramps, the deportation of survivors, the impaling of captives. And in the background, almost incidentally, they show the Assyrian camp. Oval in shape, fortified perimeter, 24 guard towers, each one featuring 3 windows. Compton measured the proportions. He noted the shape, and then he noted something that had apparently not registered with sufficient force before. Assyrian military camps were oval. Later Roman camps were rectangular. The difference is not aesthetic, it is diagnostic. If you know what you are looking for, an oval encampment of the right dimensions in the right geographical context is as distinctive as a fingerprint. Then he turned to the aerial photographs. The British Royal Flying Corps, and later the Royal Air Force, conducted extensive photographic surveys of the Levant during and after the First World War, producing images of the landscape taken before modern construction had erased the surface features that centuries of agriculture and settlement had otherwise preserved. In those photographs, in the topographical surveys produced by the British Survey of Palestine, Compton found what he was looking for north of Jerusalem. A large, distinctively oval structure, 140 meters in length, practically identical in dimensions to the newly confirmed Assyrian camp at Lachish, sitting on a hill that looked directly down into the city. But the confirmation that moved this from suggestive to staggering was not the shape, it was the name. On the early British topographical maps, the Arabic name given to that specific site was Khirbet al-Mudawwara, which translates without ambiguity as the ruins of the camp of the invading ruler. A variant recorded nearby reads Jebel el-Mudawwara, the mountain of the camp of the invading ruler. The local Arabic-speaking population, whose collective memory of the land's history stretched back through Ottoman and Crusader and Byzantine and Roman and Hellenistic layers to the substrate of ancient events, had preserved in their naming conventions the exact nature and identity of what had stood on that hill. For 2,700 years, the people living near that site had been calling it, in their own language, the ruins of the camp of the man who came to conquer. They had no particular reason to. They had no academic agenda. They were simply using the name the place had always had. Today, that hill is called Ammunition Hill. The British used it as a munitions depot in the 1930s. The Jordanian army fortified it with trenches in 1948. Israeli paratroopers fought one of the bloodiest close-quarters battles of the 1967 war across its surface. The hill has been fought over repeatedly across 3 millennia, which is perhaps less surprising once you understand that it is the dominant elevated position north of Jerusalem, the natural staging ground for any force intending to press an assault on the city from that direction. Sennacherib's engineers chose it for the same reason every subsequent commander chose it. It is simply the correct hill. The hill that controls the approach. The hill from which 24 guard towers could look directly down into the city they were preparing to destroy. And Compton found something else. Isaiah, the prophet whose writings run in parallel to the events of 701, described the Assyrian advance from the north with a precision that reads less like prophecy and more like a field report from someone watching the army move. He named the towns in sequence as the Assyrian force marched south toward Jerusalem, and he named the place where the advance would halt, a location called Nob, a priestly city whose exact position had been debated and lost to subsequent development. Isaiah wrote that the army would stand at Nob and shake its fist at the Mount of the Daughter of Zion. Stand there, not advance from there. Stand. The word implies arrival, pause, and then something other than the expected forward movement. It implies a terminus, the place where the march ended without the siege completing, the place where the camp was established and never broken down by its own occupants, because its occupants never left.
The location of Khirbet al-Mudawwara matches the prophesied position of Nob with a precision that is either the result of Isaiah being an extraordinarily accurate geographer or the result of the event having actually happened where the texts say it happened. Either explanation is, in its own way, remarkable. What is not remarkable, what is simply now a matter of published archaeological record, is that the Assyrian camp existed, was located on a specific identifiable hill north of Jerusalem, was of the correct oval shape and approximate dimensions consistent with Assyrian military camp design, and bore a name that its surrounding population had used for 2.5 millennia to describe exactly what it was. The skeptical argument from silence collapsed in June of 2024. The camp was never missing. It was always there. We just needed someone to look at what was already on the map. Now return to the medical question, because the archaeology does something the theology alone never could. It gives the plague hypothesis a geography, a specific, bounded, measurable space inside which the biological event would have been contained. 140 meters, oval perimeter, 24 guard towers, a sealed military installation on an elevated hill north of Jerusalem, occupied by a force that had been stationary for weeks in the late summer heat of the Levantine highlands, surrounded by the accumulated biological waste of an army that had been campaigning continuously since the spring. The physical conditions inside that perimeter were not merely consistent with a plague event, they were optimal for one. A closed environment, a stressed population with suppressed immune function, a sedentary encampment long enough established to support a mature rodent population. The flea-to-rat-to-human transmission chain for Yersinia pestis does not require exotic conditions. It requires exactly what that camp provided. The historical precedent for Assyrian armies carrying plague was not obscure even in antiquity. Assyrian records document catastrophic epidemic events within the empire in 765 and again in 759 before the Common Era, roughly 60 years before the Jerusalem campaign. These were not minor outbreaks. They were empire-disrupting events, recorded in the Limu lists alongside military campaigns and solar eclipses as defining events of their respective years. The Assyrian army had a documented history of moving plague across the region the way it moved iron, efficiently, without fully understanding what it was carrying, leaving devastation at every stopping point. 6 centuries earlier, the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I had attacked Egyptian forces in Syria, captured thousands of prisoners, brought them home to Anatolia, and imported with them a plague so virulent it tore through the Hittite Empire for 20 years, killing the king himself and his successor. Armies were plague vectors long before anyone understood the mechanism. They were concentrations of biological vulnerability moving across landscapes, stopping in the same water sources, sleeping in the same proximity to the same rodent populations, sharing the same immune-suppressing stress of continuous combat operations. The scale of 701 is the part that strains modern intuition. 185,000 dead in a single night. It sounds like a number invented for theological impact rather than recorded from observation. But the historical record of epidemic events offers a corrective to that intuition. When the Justinian plague reached Constantinople in 541 of the Common Era, the contemporary historian John of Ephesus recorded death tolls of
16,000 people per day within a confined urban center. 16,000 per day in a city, an open city with streets and markets and the capacity for people to flee. Now consider a sealed military camp on a single hill, with no exit, no capacity for quarantine, no understanding of what was happening, and a population density that made the crowded streets of Constantinople look spacious by comparison. The mathematics of a septicemic plague event in that environment, moving at the speed septicemic plague is documented to move, producing the kind of overnight mortality that the pathology is documented to produce, generates numbers that the ancient witnesses were not exaggerating when they recorded.
They were simply reporting what the morning showed them. Berosus, the Babylonian historian, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, recorded independently of the biblical account that God sent a pestilential distemper upon Sennacherib's army, destroying exactly 185,000 men on the first night of the siege. He was not reading the Hebrew Bible. He was drawing on Babylonian records that had been compiled separately, from a different cultural and political perspective, by a civilization that had every reason to record Assyrian military disasters with satisfaction, and no reason to invent theological miracles on behalf of the Judean God. His number matches. His mechanism matches. His timing, the first night, matches. 3 separate textual traditions, Hebrew, Babylonian, and Greek, each recording the same event from different positions, all converge on the same location, the same approximate number, and the same impossibly rapid timeline. And then there is Herodotus again, whose account demands one more careful reading before we move on. He says the mice gnawed the bowstrings, the quivers, and the leather shield straps. Think about what that actually describes, physically, in the dark. Not 1 or 2 mice, not a dozen. Enough mice to move through an entire military camp in a single night and chew through the functional components of the army's equipment across its entire population. That is not a scavenging behavior. That is a population event. A rodent bloom of the kind that occurs when a food source, specifically the grain stores and food waste of a large stationary encampment, has been available long enough to support exponential reproduction. The mice were not the cause. They were the indicator species. They were the visible surface of an invisible biological catastrophe that was already in progress before a single soldier noticed his bowstring was gone. The arrows of Resheph, the breath of Ha-Mashhit. The pestilential distemper of Berosus, the field mice of Herodotus, the septicemic cascade of modern epidemiology. These are not competing explanations. They are the same event described by observers who had access to different vocabularies. And when you lay them against the physical geography of Kurbet al-Mudawwara, against the oval perimeter on the hill that the surrounding population never stopped calling the ruins of the camp of the invading ruler, the convergence produces something that is more disturbing than any single explanation. It produces certainty, not about the mechanism, not about the theology, but about the event itself. Something happened on that hill in 701 before the Common Era. Something that entered a sealed, guarded military installation of the most formidable army on earth and left 185,000 corpses before dawn. Something that the survivors of the Assyrian Empire could not bring themselves to record accurately. That the king who ordered the siege never claimed to have survived with his dignity intact. And that the people living near that hill were still naming, 2,700 years later, in the language of the invader who never left. What Sennacherib did with that morning, what it broke inside him, and what it ultimately cost him,
is where this story ends. But the ending is not where the terror lives. The terror lives in the mechanism, in the silence, in the fact that whatever executed 185,000 men in a single night left the walls of Jerusalem completely untouched, the civilian population completely unharmed, and the physical structure of the camp completely intact. No siege ramp collapsed, no tower fell, no gate was breached. The city was simply, suddenly, inexplicably, no longer under siege. Because there was no one left to conduct one. The king, who believed he had killed the gods of the ancient world, woke up to discover that something had killed his army, and he had to walk back to Nineveh carrying that knowledge alone, because there was no one left from the camp to share it with him. What that walk cost him, and how it ended, is where we are going next. He went home. That is the whole of it, stated in its barest form. Sennacherib, king of the world, unrivaled lord of Assyria, the man who had spent a decade systematically dismantling the ancient Near East, gathered whatever was left of his retinue and walked north. His own annals, the carefully curated stone cylinders he commissioned to broadcast his glory across the empire, go silent on the subject of Jerusalem with the completeness of a door slamming shut. He does not claim victory. He does not claim a negotiated withdrawal. He does not claim anything. He pivots from the cage and bird declaration to a long enumeration of tribute received and never mentions the city again. In the entire surviving corpus of Assyrian royal inscriptions, this is almost without precedent. Sennacherib recorded everything. He recorded the exact number of enemy soldiers killed at specific battles. He recorded the inventory of plundered temples down to the weight of individual objects. He recorded the dimensions of the siege ramps at Lachish. The silence around Jerusalem is not neutral. It is the most eloquent thing he ever said. He lived another 20 years. They were not peaceful ones. The records that survive from his reign after 701 describe a man still conducting campaigns, still building monuments, still dictating the grandeur that imperial kingship required him to perform. He rebuilt Nineveh on an almost hallucinatory scale, constructing a palace he called the Palace Without Rival, lining its walls with carved reliefs depicting his victories, including Lachish, in extraordinary detail. Lachish was there in stone forever, 144 carved panels showing the siege ramps, the prisoners, the impalings, the processing of a defeated city. Jerusalem was not. In a palace whose explicit purpose was to function as a permanent record of Sennacherib's military supremacy, the campaign that ended without resolution occupies no space at all. The stone remembers everything except the hill north of Jerusalem. He was murdered in his own temple by his own sons while praying to the god Nisroch. The account appears in both the Hebrew scriptures and in Babylonian records, with enough corroborating detail to suggest it is substantially accurate rather than invented. The specific irony is not subtle. The king who had taunted the people of Jerusalem that no god had ever protected its people from the Assyrian king was killed, while at prayer, by members of his own bloodline. The Assyrian succession crisis that followed was severe enough to consume years and nearly fracture the empire. One son, Esarhaddon, eventually prevailed, but the internal conflict cost the empire a momentum it never fully recovered. What Sennacherib could not kill, it turns out, was not Jerusalem. Cities are infrastructure. They can always be rebuilt and taken and destroyed again and rebuilt once more. What he could not kill was the interpretive framework that the events of 701 produced. What survived on that hill was not walls, not a population, not a dynasty. What survived was a story. And that story became one of the most consequential ideological weapons in the history of religion.
The iconographic legacy of the celestial assassin, the entity that moved through the sealed camp and left nothing alive, did not calcify into a single image. It proliferated. It branched. It adapted itself to every subsequent tradition that inherited the Hebrew scriptural canon, and found in this event something it needed for its own theological purposes. In the centuries immediately following 701, the destruction of Sennacherib's army was cited in Jewish tradition not as a singular miracle, but as a template, a proof of concept, evidence that the divine did not always work through armies or kings or human instruments, that it had available to it a different order of intervention entirely, one that operated outside the causal logic of the physical world and was therefore immune to the counter-strategies that physical power could devise. By the rabbinic period, the entity responsible for the destruction had acquired a profile dense with accumulated theological weight. Samael, the figure who merged the functions of the destroyer and the adversary and the Lord of Death across successive layers of interpretive tradition, was described in the mystical literature with a specificity that reads less like theology and more like a technical specification. He is described as cold, always cold, cold beauty, cold intelligence, cold desire. The texts note that he produces no heat, that proximity to him generates a specific physical sensation described as the chill of the shadow. This is not poetic language in context. This is diagnostic language. The ancient traditions were attempting to describe something they had observed or believed had been observed in terms precise enough to be recognizable on the next encounter. The medieval Christian tradition inherited the entity's portfolio and did what medieval Christianity reliably did with powerful, frightening things. It bureaucratized it. The angel of death became a figure in a hierarchy, assigned a specific rank, given a specific domain of authority with defined limits, incorporated into a theological architecture that made it manageable by placing it firmly within the chain of divine command. The threatening autonomy of Ha-Mashhit, the destroyer that had to be caged with blood, was softened into a figure that acted only on explicit divine instruction, always and without exception. The iconographic tradition that followed reflected this management. Renaissance painting gave the angel of death a grave, luminous face, gestures of care and dignity, the solemnity of a professional performing a solemn duty. It gave it wings arranged not for menace, but for grandeur. It made it, in the most precise sense of the word, palatial. Something fit to hang on a wall. Something that could be looked at without flinching. The original was never meant to be looked at. It was meant to pass through without being seen, without triggering a sound, without leaving a mark. Its iconographic reduction to something aesthetically manageable was itself a kind of theological defense mechanism. If you can picture it clearly, it cannot really be the thing the ancient records described. The thing the ancient records described did not have a face you could paint. It moved through a guarded perimeter in the dark and killed 185,000 men between midnight and dawn, and left the physical infrastructure of the camp intact, as though it had never been there at all. You cannot paint that. You can only describe it in the way you describe wind, by what it moved through and what it left behind. The Persian tradition contributed its own version of the entity, the Angra Mainyu, the principle of destructive entropy given will and direction, operating at the boundary between the structured world and the void that presses against it from outside.
The Islamic tradition preserves Azrael, the angel of death, whose scale is described in the mystical literature as so vast that the entire physical earth rests between the angel's shoulders, and whose function is defined with a clarity that leaves no room for misunderstanding. He takes. That is the complete job description. He takes what was alive and delivers it to what comes next, without judgment, without delay, without the interference of human pleading or divine reconsideration. His name, in the Arabic root, carries the meaning helper, which is either a profound piece of theological irony or a very precise description of what the ancient world believed death actually was. Not an enemy, not a punishment, but the final, efficient resolution of a tension that living bodies cannot sustain forever.
The Greek tradition sent Herodotus to record the mice, and in doing so, preserved the biological evidence without understanding it as such. The Babylonian tradition sent Berosus to record the pestilential distemper and the number 185,000 and the timeline of a single night, preserving the event in a tradition with no theological stake in its miraculous quality. The Hebrew tradition sent Isaiah to stand in the city and write, in real time, the sequential geography of the advance and the name of the place where the advance would stop. Each tradition looking at the same hill from a different direction. Each tradition preserving a different fragment of the same broken object. None of them individually, holding enough of the pieces to reconstruct what it was. All of them together, laid against the oval shape on the British aerial photograph and the Arabic name that the local population had been using for 2,700 years, without anyone asking them why, producing the outline of something that is neither miracle nor coincidence. Now, here is the irony that lives inside the entire structure of this story, the one that the ancient sources circle without naming, the one that the iconographic tradition decorates around without ever quite depicting. Sennacherib was right, not about everything, but about the central claim of his theology, that human power, organized to sufficient scale, processed to sufficient efficiency, aimed with sufficient coldness, becomes something indistinguishable from a natural force. The Assyrian Empire proved this. It processed 46 Judean cities the way a river processes stone, not with malice, with physics. The siege engine was not cruel. The battering ram was not angry. They were optimal. Sennacherib's genius was in understanding that if you make destruction efficient enough, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like an inevitability. And an enemy who believes your victory is inevitable has already surrendered, even if they haven't put down their weapons yet. He was right about that. He was wrong about one thing only. He believed that this principle was exclusive to human power, that only his kind of organized, engineered, institutional force could achieve that quality of cold inevitability, that the universe's remaining forces were available for his use and subject to his direction. He camped on a hill, and something camped on that hill with him, and it was older than his empire and colder than his engineering, and it did not distinguish between the man who gave the orders and the man who followed them. It was optimal, too. It was just optimizing for something other than his survival. The deepest irony is that the entity which destroyed the greatest army on earth did not do it to save Jerusalem. The text does not claim that. The city endured, the people survived, but they did not prosper. The tribute had already been paid, the gold stripped from the temple doors, the daughters taken north to Nineveh. The siege ended, but the cost of the siege did not vanish with the ending. What the destroyer did was not rescue, it was correction. Something had exceeded its permitted amplitude,
and the correction arrived the same way all corrections arrive in complex systems, not through a frontal attack on the strongest point, but through the exploitation of the vulnerability that the system's own success had generated. The camp that was too large, too stationary, too confident, too sealed. The army that had done everything right by every measure that human military science could supply, and had therefore not noticed what was accumulating in the dark between its guard towers.
That pattern, the pattern where the greatest vulnerability is generated by the greatest concentration of strength, does not belong to the ancient world. You have felt it yourself. In whatever domain you have watched something powerful enough to believe it was immune to correction, discover, too late, that the correction was already inside the perimeter. The company too dominant to imagine a competitor. The relationship too certain to notice the thing eroding its foundation. The body healthy enough to ignore the signal that was already spreading through the system. The celestial assassin does not announce itself. It does not require your recognition or your fear or your theological framework. It requires only that you have created, somewhere inside your most fortified position, the conditions for what it carries. The question that this story leaves behind, the one that splits the people who have heard it into two camps that cannot reconcile their positions, is this. Sennacherib built the most efficient instrument of destruction the ancient world had ever produced, and it was destroyed not by a comparable human force, but by the very conditions its own efficiency created. Hezekiah built the strongest wall he could, and stripped the temple to pay the tribute, and sealed the city's water inside solid rock, and watched his people crowd into 125 acres of terrified, insufficient space. And the city survived, though not unscathed, not whole, not unwounded. The question is not whether Hezekiah or Sennacherib was the better king, or the more justified one, or the one whom history should honor. The question is whether you believe that the force which moved through that camp did so because Jerusalem deserved to survive, or whether the camp simply provided the optimal conditions for the correction to arrive, and the survival was incidental, and the desert between the camp and the city was wide enough that the mechanism did not reach the walls before the threshold of dawn. If you believe the first, then this story is about divine protection, and the lesson is that some forms of defiance are honored by forces larger than the armies arrayed against them. If you believe the second, then this story is about biology and geography and the self-defeating logic of unchecked power, and the lesson is the same. There was a thread in this story that this telling did not follow, because following it would have required an entirely different account. The mice, not as evidence, but as actors. Because Herodotus did not say the mice appeared the night of the massacre. He said the mice gnawed the bowstrings and the quivers and the shield straps, and that this was what the morning revealed, alongside everything else. Which means, whatever the field mice of the Levant were carrying that night, they were carrying it in the direction of the walls of Jerusalem when dawn stopped them. 200 meters from the perimeter of the camp, the wind was coming, as the prevailing winds of the Jerusalem highlands do in late summer, from the north. The camp was north of the city. Hezekiah's engineers had sealed every spring and stream, but they had not sealed the air. What stopped at the walls of Jerusalem that morning, and what continued moving south through the highlands toward Egypt, and what the Egyptian records of that same approximate period describe finding in their border regions in the form of epidemic events that their own texts struggle to explain, that is a different video. But you have already been inside it longer than you realize.